The glasses were crystal, the champagne was French, and Lady Octavia Pemberton snapped her fingers twice, sharp as a whip crack, right in the middle of Langley Chase's glittering ballroom. "Don't breathe on the glasses, girl. Some of us must drink from them." The circle around her laughed, loud, cruel, delighted. The young woman in the borrowed apron did not laugh. She lowered her eyes, lifted her tray, and said nothing at all. 200 guests spun beneath 6 chandeliers that night, diamonds swinging from ears and throats, silk trains sweeping marble floors polished to a mirror shine. Nobody in that ballroom looked twice at the maid pouring their wine. Nobody except one couple, standing near the fireplace, who went the color of ash the moment she turned her face toward the light. They knew her. They said nothing. They only stared, then looked away fast, the way a man looks away from a debt he cannot pay. Because they owed her too. Every chandelier in that room was floating on borrowed money. Every silk gown was paid for on credit. Every motor car parked outside was 2 payments from repossession. Every smile was a mortgage wearing a dinner jacket. And tonight, without knowing it, the lender was the one carrying the champagne tray. Her name was Wilhelmina Ashbourne. Nobody in that ballroom knew it. They only knew the discovery, Lady Pemberton's little joke for the season. By the time this night ended, every person laughing in that circle would know her name. They would never forget it. But before we continue, subscribe now and tell us in the comments where you are watching from and what time you saw this video. Tonight's story is one you will never forget.
Now let's go back. 2 days. Before the ball. Before the apron.
Before anyone laughed. The Fox and Crown Inn sat at the edge of the village of Little Fenwick, 3 miles from Langley Chase, with low beams and a fire that smoked more than it warmed. Wilhelmina Ashbourne had taken a room there under a plain name, wearing plain wool, carrying one small trunk and a black leather notebook she never let out of her sight. She had come to Gloucestershire to look at land and ledgers, and the people who owed her family's bank money they could not repay. Lady Octavia Pemberton swept into the inn that afternoon looking for fresh flowers for her carriage and left with something else entirely. She saw the quiet young woman sitting near the window, plainly dressed, plate untouched, notebook open on her lap, and something in Octavia's eye lit up the way a fox's eye lights up near a henhouse. "Who is that creature?" Octavia asked the innkeeper, not bothering to lower her voice. "A lodger, my lady. Keeps to herself. She has no manners and no color in her dress. Perfect." Octavia clapped her gloved hands together, delighted with herself. Every party needs something to laugh at. She crossed the room, skirts hissing over the floorboards, and looked down at Mina the way one looks down at a horse being considered for purchase. "You, girl, how would you like to earn a shilling and see the inside of a duke's house?" Mina closed her notebook slowly. "That depends what you want me to do, my lady. Serve, at the ball, carry trays, pour wine, curtsy when spoken to." Octavia smiled, and it was not a kind smile. "You will wear an apron. You will not speak unless spoken to. And you will be the funniest thing anyone has seen all season." The innkeeper's wife stiffened behind the bar, but said nothing. One did not correct Lady Pemberton. Mina looked up at her, really looked. She saw the fine coat with the seams let out twice to fit a body that had once been slimmer. She saw the gloves, expensive but 3 years out of fashion. She saw a woman spending money she did not have to look like money she did not have. She saw, in short, exactly the kind of client her father's bank kept careful notes on. "I accept," Mina said quietly. Octavia clapped again. "Splendid. You will be the discovery of the season." She swept out without another word, already composing in her head how she would announce it to her friends. Mina opened her notebook and wrote one line, the first entry for a new name. Lady Octavia Pemberton sees a person and prices them before she greets them. Watch. She closed the notebook and looked out the window at the long gravel road leading toward Langley Chase. The ducal seat rising gray and enormous against the autumn sky, every window already glowing gold with candlelight for a ball that had not yet begun. Somewhere inside those walls was a mortgage with her family's bank stamped on the corner of every page. Somewhere inside those walls, half the guests owed her money they had borrowed and never quite managed to pay back. Her father had built an empire on one simple test: not a man's title, not his bloodline, how he treated a stranger who had nothing to offer him. Tonight, Langley Chase was about to take that test without knowing it was being graded. The morning of the ball, Octavia arrived at the inn with a housemaid's apron folded over one arm like a prize she had personally hunted down. "Put this on," she told Mina, "and for heaven's sake, do something about your hair. You look like a farmer's daughter." "I am a farmer's daughter," Mina said, which was, in its way, entirely true. Her father had started with 3 farms and a single loan office above a bakery. Octavia did not hear the honesty in it. She heard only confirmation of the joke and laughed. At Langley Chase that evening, footmen lined the drive in powdered wigs, and motor cars crested with family shields, rolled up the gravel one after another. The Duke of Langley himself stood at the top of the steps, greeting his guests with the easy, slightly baffled warmth of a man who had inherited a great house and very little idea how to keep it. Gervase Langley was 52, silver at the temples, kind in the vague way of men who had never once been told no in their lives. He did not know, standing there shaking hands, that Langley Chase's roof, its stables, its very land beneath his polished shoes, belonged in large part to a bank he had never bothered to learn the name of. Inside, the ballroom blazed. 6 chandeliers, 200 candles, an orchestra tuning in the corner, footmen circling with trays of champagne, and among them, wearing a borrowed apron 2 sizes too large, walked Wilhelmina Ashbourne. Octavia clapped her hands for attention near the punch table, gathering a circle of her particular friends. 3 ladies in silk, 2 gentlemen in tails, all faces Mina had already begun to catalogue in her mind. "My dears," Octavia announced, "allow me to present my little discovery, found her at the village inn, plain as a turnip. I thought, what better amusement for the evening than to dress her up and watch her try to be useful?" The circle laughed. Someone said, "Octavia, you are wicked," in a tone that meant, "Please keep being wicked, it is delightful." Mina lowered her eyes and lifted her tray. Inside her apron pocket, hidden, her small black notebook pressed against her hip like a second heartbeat. She wrote nothing yet, she only watched. A woman in emerald silk leaned close to inspect her the way one inspects a new horse, lifting Mina's chin with 2 gloved fingers. "She has good bones, at least," the woman said to Octavia, as though Mina were not standing there at all. "Where did you say you found her?" "The inn, a lodger. Nobody knows her, nobody will miss her come Monday." Mina held very still under the woman's fingers. She thought of her father, who had once told her, "The moment a person stops seeing you as a person, write down their name. You will need it later." She wrote it down later. In the corridor between the ballroom and the kitchens, in the space of 10 seconds, she opened her notebook and wrote, "Lady in emerald silk, lifted my chin like I was livestock. Ask Fenwick whose account she runs." Then she closed the notebook, smoothed her apron, and went back in to pour more wine. The first real cruelty of the night came an hour later, when Octavia decided the joke needed a bigger stage. "You," she said, snapping her fingers at Mina across the ballroom floor, loud enough for a dozen guests to turn. "Serve the Duke himself. Let everyone see what I found." A ripple of interest went through the room. Nothing amused the aristocracy quite like watching one of their own be handed something unexpected, even something as small as a strange maid with a wine bottle. Mina crossed the floor with the tray steady in her hands, curtsying before the Duke of Langley, who looked at her with mild, distracted kindness. "Thank you," he said simply, as she poured. It was the first ordinary human sentence anyone had spoken to her all evening. She wrote it down later. "The Duke says thank you to a maid, small mercy. Does not know what his house is worth or who owns it. But mercy from one man was not the plan for the evening. As Mina straightened from her curtsy, someone's elbow, Octavia's own, precisely placed, struck the tray from beneath. Red wine sheeted down the front of Mina's apron in a long dark stain, and the room, on cue, erupted into laughter. "Oh, how clumsy," Octavia said, not troubling to hide the satisfaction in her voice. "Perhaps we found her at the inn because the inn could not keep her either." Laughter again, brighter this time. Someone applauded, actually applauded, as though Mina's humiliation were a performance staged for their pleasure. Mina stood with wine soaking through wool to her skin, face burning, and said nothing. She only bowed her head and murmured, "I beg your pardon, my lady," in a voice of perfect, practiced meekness. Inside, something colder was forming. Not anger, arithmetic. She thought of the ledger sitting in Fenwick's traveling case at that very moment, 3 miles away at the inn, waiting for her signal. Pemberton Hall's mortgage. 6 years past due on the interest, twice restructured already as a courtesy her late father had insisted on before his death, out of some old, soft-hearted belief that struggling families deserved a second chance. Octavia Pemberton had just spent that second chance on a joke about a wine stain. Mina wrote nothing in the moment. She simply excused herself to change her apron, and in the corridor, alone, she allowed herself exactly 4 seconds of shaking anger before she straightened her spine and went back to work. It was the second humiliation of the night that drew blood, though not Mina's own. A real housemaid named Betsy Larkin, 17 years old, freckled, quick on her feet, and quicker with her kindness, had been assigned to help the new girl find her way around the kitchens. Betsy had taken one look at Mina's shaking hands after the wine incident and quietly steered her toward the safest corner of the ballroom circuit, murmuring instructions under her breath. "Keep to the far wall when you pour, miss. Fewer eyes there. And mind Lady Pemberton, she likes to watch people fail." Mina had looked at her with something close to gratitude. She wrote that night in her notebook, before anything went wrong, Betsy Larkin, kind to a stranger for no reason but kindness. Remember this name above all others. An hour later, carrying a tray of oyster shells toward the supper room, Mina's foot caught the hem of her too large apron, and the tray tipped, shells and ice scattering across the marble in a great crash that turned every head in the room. Before anyone could speak, Betsy stepped forward. "That was my fault, my lady," Betsy said quickly, quietly, though it was nothing of the kind. "I set the tray uneven. I'm sorry." Octavia's eyes narrowed with pleasure at the fresh chance for spectacle. She turned to the butler standing rigid near the supper door and gave a single, small nod. The butler's hand rose and fell. The slap landed across Betsy's cheek, sharp enough to echo off the marble, sharp enough to silence the orchestra mid-phrase. The room gasped, a ripple of shock moving from table to table, some guests turning away in discomfort, others leaning in, hungry for more. Betsy did not cry out. She pressed her hand to her reddening cheek and stood perfectly straight, eyes down, the way servants were trained to stand no matter what happened to them. Mina stood 3 feet away, apron still stained with wine, watching a blow meant for her land on someone else's face. She could have spoken. One sentence, "It was my fault, not hers," would have ended it. But one sentence would have also ended the disguise, and the disguise was the only weapon she had that night. So she stood, and she said nothing, and she let it happen, and something in her chest twisted so hard it nearly broke through her calm. That night, in her notebook, she wrote the hardest line she had written in years. "I let Betsy Larkin take a blow meant for me. I will spend the rest of my life paying that debt back." Starting tonight, the viewer should feel it here as sharply as Mina did. Even the woman holding all the power in that room still owed something before the night was through. Now, a truth the viewer has not yet been told, and it changes everything that came before it. Wilhelmina Ashbourne had not come to Gloucestershire by accident. She had not stumbled into Octavia Pemberton's path by chance. Her father's bank, Ashbourne and Sons, held the mortgage on Pemberton Hall, 6 years overdue in its interest payments, restructured twice already at her father's personal insistence before his death 18 months prior. Her father, old Josiah Ashbourne, had built his fortune from nothing, 3 farms and a bakery loan office, and he had done it with one rule stamped into every clerk who worked for him. Before you renew any man's loan, learn how he treats a stranger who cannot help him. Kings and dukes could fool an accountant with numbers on a page. They could not fool a stranger standing in their own kitchen. Mina had inherited the bank at 25, and she had inherited the rule with it. She traveled the county quietly, plainly dressed, unannounced, watching how her debtors behaved when they believed no one of consequence was watching. It was, in its way, the family business, not banking, judgment, wearing banking's clothes. She had planned to call the Pemberton loan before this ball ever began. Mr. Horace Fenwick, her banker, and the one man in Gloucestershire who knew her true face, had the papers drawn already, waiting at the inn 3 miles down the road. The only question left unanswered when she arrived at Langley Chase was not whether the debt would be called. It was how publicly. Octavia Pemberton had just answered that question herself, with a wine stain and a slap and a joke about a turnip. There was one more truth folded into this, and it was not a clean one, not simple villain and simple victim, because life rarely obliges storytellers that way. Mina had glimpsed a letter earlier that evening, left open on a writing desk in the Pembertons' private sitting room while she'd been sent to fetch a forgotten shawl. It was addressed to a school in Cheltenham, and it spoke of Octavia's late sister's 3 children, orphaned 4 years ago, whose fees Octavia had been quietly paying term after term, money she plainly did not have, money that had driven half the family silver into pawnbrokers' hands and Pemberton Hall into the debt now sitting in Mina's ledger. Octavia Pemberton was cruel. That much was true, and the viewer has seen it with their own eyes tonight. But she was also drowning to keep 3 children in shoes and school books, and drowning had made her desperate, and desperate had made her worse. It did not excuse the slap. It did not excuse the wine, or the turnip joke, or the chin lifted like livestock. Cruelty is cruelty no matter what is underneath it. But it made the ledger heavier in Mina's hands that night, not lighter, because now she would have to decide not only how to call a debt, but how to be fair to a woman who did not deserve fairness, and to 3 children who had done nothing wrong at all. She closed her notebook, tucked it back into her apron pocket, and returned to the ballroom to finish pouring wine for people who did not know her name. Small cracks had already begun showing in Octavia's evening, cracks too small for most of the room to notice, but the kind of cracks that build toward collapse. At supper, seated near the head of the table, Octavia turned to greet Sir Reginald Cabot, her largest personal creditor outside the bank, a man to whom she owed nearly as much as she owed Ashbourne and Sons. Sir Reginald looked at her for exactly 1 second, said, "Lady Pemberton," in a tone with no warmth in it at all, and turned his attention pointedly to the guest on his other side. Octavia's smile did not waver in front of the table, but her knuckles went white around her wineglass. Across the room, the Duke of Langley leaned toward his steward and asked quietly, "Who is the girl serving the oysters? The one Lady Pemberton keeps parading about." "Nobody knows, Your Grace," the steward admitted. "Some lodger from the village, they say." The Duke frowned, faintly troubled by something he could not name, and said nothing more. But the question had been asked, and questions like that do not simply vanish. They sit in a room and wait. And near the fireplace, the couple who had gone pale at the sight of Mina earlier in the evening, Lord and Lady Whitmore, whose own estate carried a mortgage with Ashbourne and Sons, drawn up personally by Mina's father 3 years before his death, began very quietly, when they believed no one was watching, to incline their heads to the maid whenever she passed with her tray. A small nod, a murmured, "Thank you, miss," where other guests offered nothing at all. One person did notice. Betsy Larkin, cheek still faintly pink from the slap, caught Lord Whitmore's small bow to a servant girl and filed it away with the quiet, sharp instinct of someone who had spent her whole short life reading rooms for danger and kindness both. She said nothing, but she watched Mina a little differently after that. Small wins for the viewer, threaded through a night that had otherwise gone badly for the person carrying the trays. Sir Reginald's snub, the Duke's unanswered question, the Whitmore's silent bows. None of it undid the wine stain or the slap, but all of it was the debt-collecting interest, quietly, in full view of a room that had no idea it was being watched, weighed, and judged. The ball rolled on toward its second act, for a night like this always has 3 great stages, and the second was crueler than the first. Octavia, emboldened by the laughter she had already won, decided the discovery needed a formal introduction to the wider room. She rapped a spoon against her champagne glass until the orchestra paused and conversation dimmed. "My friends," she announced, voice pitched to Carrie, "before supper concludes, I must share tonight's greatest entertainment. This girl," she gestured at Mina with 2 fingers, the way one gestures at a piece of furniture, "was discovered at the village inn only 2 days ago. No family, no manners, no prospects whatsoever, and yet here she stands, serving Gloucestershire's finest, and doing it, I dare say, rather worse than my own scullery maids." Laughter rolled through the room, warmer and crueler for having an audience of 200 now instead of a dozen. "Stand up straight, girl," Octavia said, turning back to Mina. "Let them see you properly. Turn around." Mina set down her tray with careful, deliberate calm and turned, slowly, in a full circle, as though modeling a gown rather than being paraded like livestock at auction. Her face showed nothing. Her hands did not shake. "There," Octavia said, satisfied. "Isn't she precisely the sort of creature one forgets by breakfast?" "I have an excellent memory, my lady," Mina said quietly, the first word she had spoken above a whisper all night. "I remember everyone I meet." A ripple of surprised laughter went through the crowd at the maid's unexpected boldness, and Octavia's eyes flashed with irritation at being answered at all. "Careful, girl," Octavia said, voice dropping low and sharp. "That tray is worth more than your year." "Then I shall carry it carefully, my lady," Mina answered, lifting the tray again, steady as stone. "I always mind what things are worth." Octavia did not understand the second meaning folded inside that sentence. Nobody in the room did. Only Mina knew exactly what the tray was worth, exactly what the chandeliers were worth, exactly what Pemberton Hall itself was worth on paper, sitting in a traveling case 3 miles away. She curtsied, low and correct, and walked back toward the kitchens, apron swishing, notebook pressed silent against her hip. Behind her, the laughter slowly died into ordinary conversation, and the orchestra resumed, and nobody thought of the maid again for nearly 20 minutes. 20 minutes was not very long, as it turned out. Mr. Horace Fenwick arrived at Langley Chase at 10:15 that evening, and the moment his motor car crunched up the gravel drive, the footmen exchanged glances, because no one had expected a 4th banker in a house already thick with lords and ladies. Fenwick was a narrow man, gray at the temples, with a face built for closing doors and closing accounts, carrying a leather traveling case under one arm that he did not once set down, not even to accept a glass of sherry from the footman at the entrance. "I require a moment with the Duke," he told the butler at the door, "and I am told Lady Pemberton is present tonight as well. Both, if possible. Together, if possible." The butler, sensing something in the banker's tone that did not invite delay, showed him directly into the ballroom. Word moves fast in a room full of bored aristocrats looking for their next diversion. By the time Fenwick crossed the floor, a curious hush had already begun rippling outward from the door, guest to guest, the orchestra's music thinning under the weight of 200 people, all straining to hear one conversation at once. The Duke of Langley turned first, puzzled. "Fenwick, is it? Whitmore's man of business, I believe. Or Ashbourne and Sons, your grace, Fenwick corrected, with the particular calm of a man who has delivered difficult news to powerful people many times before and has stopped finding it frightening. I act for Miss Ashbourne personally. Ashbourne, Octavia repeated the name aloud, testing it, a flicker of unease crossing her face for the first time all night, though she could not yet say why. Fenwick did not look at the Duke again. He did not look at Octavia. He turned deliberately and walked past 6 lords and 4 ladies, and one entire supper table laid with silver, straight toward the woman in the wine-stained apron standing near the kitchen door with an empty tray in her hands, and Horace Fenwick bowed. Fully, formally. The bow one gives a client whose signature can end an estate with a single stroke of a pen. Miss Ashbourne, he said, voice carrying clean across a ballroom that had gone entirely, utterly silent. The papers are ready. Nobody breathed. Somewhere near the supper table, a glass slipped from a gloved hand and shattered against the marble floor, and the sound seemed to last far longer than a single dropped glass had any right to. Octavia Pemberton's smile did not vanish all at once. It died in stages, the way ice cracks before it finally gives way. First a flicker of confusion, then a flash of disbelief, then, as the room's silence stretched on and every head turned toward the maid she had mocked all evening, something that looked very much like fear. Ashbourne, Octavia said again, quieter now, the name landing on her like a stone. You cannot be. Wilhelmina Ashbourne, Mina said, setting down her tray at last, untying the wine-stained apron from around her waist with slow, unhurried hands, the way a person removes a costume once the play has ended. Ashbourne and Sons. I believe you have an account with us, Lady Pemberton. The gasps that followed were not the polite gasps of drawing-room gossip. They were the raw, involuntary sound of 200 people realizing, all at once, that they had spent an entire evening laughing at the person who held their future in a leather traveling case. You called me your discovery, Lady Pemberton, Mina said, and her voice, though quiet, carried to every corner of that vast, silent room. Tonight the county discovers you. Octavia's hand rose to her throat, grasping for the string of pearls there, as though they might anchor her to solid ground. This is some kind of jest, some cruel joke, surely. It was a joke, my lady, Mina agreed calmly. Yours. 2 days ago, at the inn. Every party needs something to laugh at, I believe you said. She turned slowly, taking in the frozen faces around her, the emerald silk woman who had lifted her chin like livestock, the circle of laughing friends, Sir Reginald Cabot going pale near the supper table, the Duke himself standing rigid and uncomprehending at the center of it all. I have been listening all night, and I have been writing. She drew the small black notebook from her apron pocket and held it up, not to read from it, only to let the room see it existed. 1 line for every person I meet, she said. Some of you will not enjoy your entries. The silence in that ballroom was the kind that has weight. It pressed down on shoulders. It bent heads. 200 people who had come dressed in silk and diamonds to be entertained now stood frozen, understanding, all at once, exactly whose money had paid for the champagne in their glasses. Fenwick opened the traveling case and withdrew a bound ledger, its leather cover embossed with the Ashbourne seal, and every eye in the room fixed on it as though it were a loaded weapon. Lady Pemberton, Mina said, and her tone shifted now, not cruel, not gloating, simply final. The tone of a woman closing a book she had read many times before. Pemberton Hall's mortgage has stood in arrears for 6 years. My father renewed it twice, against the advice of his own clerks, because he believed every family deserved a second chance to prove itself worthy of trust. She paused. Tonight, in front of this room, you were given that test. You handed a stranger a stained apron and a slap meant for someone else's cheek, and you called it entertainment. Miss Ashbourne, I beg you. Octavia's voice cracked, all its former haughtiness gone, replaced by something raw and frightened. I have children to think of, my sister's children. Please, I did not know. I know about the children. Mina said, and something in her voice softened, just slightly, just enough for those closest to hear it. I saw the letter to their school this evening, Lady Pemberton. I know what this debt has cost you to carry quietly, and what it will cost 3 innocent children if I am not careful with how I collect it. A murmur moved through the crowd, confusion mixing now with something else, the uncomfortable understanding that villain and victim were, in this moment, standing far closer together than any of them had expected. The note is called tonight, Mina continued, turning back to Fenwick, who held the papers ready. Pemberton Hall passes to administration, effective this evening, under the terms already drawn. She let that land, watched Octavia's face crumple, and then continued before despair could finish its work. But the children's school fees at Cheltenham will be paid in full quietly from the estate's remaining assets for the full term of their education. That is not mercy for you, Lady Pemberton. That is mercy for them. You will not enjoy losing your house. You will not be spared that. But you will not be the reason 3 orphan children lose their schooling either. Octavia stood frozen, tears now openly on her face. The great Lady Pemberton, who had never once looked at a servant above the collar, undone in front of the same circle of friends who had laughed with her not 30 minutes before. The room, still holding its collective breath, turned as one when Mina addressed the Duke directly. "Your Grace," she said, and Gervase Langley, startled at being spoken to so plainly by the woman he had thanked, politely, for a glass of wine an hour earlier. "Langley Chase carries a mortgage with my bank as well, considerably larger than the Pembertons." The Duke's face went the color of the tablecloth. I was not aware the arrangement was so precarious, Miss Ashbourne. I assure you my steward manages." "Your steward manages it adequately, Your Grace," Mina said. "You yourself have never once asked to see the ledger. That is not uncommon among men of your position. It is, however, a habit I intend to change tonight." She glanced once toward Betsy Larkin, who stood near the kitchen door still nursing a faintly bruised cheek, watching the entire scene unfold with wide, disbelieving eyes. "Your mortgage will be renewed, Your Grace," Mina said, loud enough now for the whole ballroom to hear clearly, every syllable landing like a bell. "On one condition announced here tonight in front of every guest in this room, so that no one may claim later they did not hear it plainly." The Duke swallowed. "Name it. Every servant's wage in this house and in every household under your patronage across this county is doubled, effective the 1st of the month. Inspected yearly by my office without warning." Mina's eyes moved deliberately to Betsy, starting with Miss Larkin, whose wages will be doubled first, and whose face was struck tonight for a mistake that was never hers. A gasp went through the crowd again, sharper this time, and several guests turned instinctively to look at Betsy, who stood frozen, one hand pressed to her cheek, tears now standing bright in her eyes for entirely different reasons than the slap had caused an hour before. "You may accept these terms, Your Grace," Mina said, "or you may find another bank willing to carry a mortgage this large on a house this mortgage to its chimneys. I do not believe you will find one before the frost sets in." The Duke of Langley, host of the grandest ball Gloucestershire had seen in a decade, looked around at 200 frozen faces, at his own household staff standing rigid along the walls, at the woman in the ruined apron who had just rearranged the entire county's fortunes with a few calm sentences, and said, simply, "Agreed. Gladly agreed, Miss Ashbourne." Mina turned last to Octavia, who stood swaying slightly, supported now by the arm of a friend who 20 minutes earlier had been laughing loudest of all, and now could not meet anyone's eyes. Mina lifted the stained apron she had removed and held it out, not unkindly, but without softness either. "It fits anyone, my lady," she said. "That is rather the point." Octavia stared at the offered apron, as though it were a mirror she could not look away from. Her hands trembled as she reached out and, after a long, terrible pause, took it from Mina's hands, the very garment she had mocked all evening now resting undeniable in her own 2 fingers. The room watched a woman who had never once curtsied to anyone below her own rank hold a servant's apron in front of 200 witnesses, and not one person laughed. Not one. "I never meant," Octavia began, and stopped because there was nothing left to say that would undo the last 4 hours. "I know," Mina said, and there was, at last, something almost gentle in her voice. "That is precisely the trouble with cruelty. Lady Pemberton, it rarely feels like cruelty from the inside. It only ever looks like a joke." She turned then, and walked from the center of the ballroom toward the great doors, wine-stained apron left behind in Octavia's hands, and the silence that followed her was total, unbroken. The kind of silence a room only produces once in a generation. Somewhere near the fireplace, Lord and Lady Whitmore, the couple who had recognized her from the very first moment and bowed to her quietly all evening when no one was watching, stepped forward now, openly, and inclined their heads to her as she passed. No longer a secret gesture, but a public one. The first 2 people in that ballroom, brave enough to show the whole room exactly who deserved the bow. Others followed, slowly, reluctantly, but they followed. By the time the story of that night finished traveling through Gloucestershire, and then through London, and then, in whispered letters and breathless gossip columns, through half of England itself, the shape of it had simplified the way stories always do into a single unforgettable image. They made the maid serve at the Duke's ball, and the maid owned half the county before the last dance was played. The truth, as it usually is, was heavier and more complicated than the gossip allowed. Pemberton Hall did pass to administration within the month. Its grand rooms shuttered, its silver sold at auction to pay what remained of Octavia's debts after the Cheltenham school fees were settled in full, quietly, exactly as Mina had promised. Octavia Pemberton left Gloucestershire to live in a modest cottage near her sister's old parish, and the great lady who had never once looked at a servant above the collar learned, in the smallest and hardest way possible, precisely what it felt like to be looked at as though she did not matter. She was not ruined utterly. Mina had made certain of that, for the sake of 3 children who had done nothing wrong. But she was ruined enough, and publicly enough, that the lesson could never be forgotten by anyone who had stood in that ballroom. And word of it reached every estate in the county within days, carried faster than any newspaper by the servants themselves, who understood exactly what it meant and repeated it to each other with quiet, fierce satisfaction. At Langley Chase, the Duke kept his word. Servant wages doubled that winter across every household under his patronage, inspected yearly by Ashbourne and Sons exactly as promised, and Gervase Langley, who had never once thought to ask his own steward how his staff were paid, found himself, rather to his own surprise, becoming known in later years as one of the more decent men of his generation. Small redemptions happen quietly. The narrator would tell you, if you are the sort of man willing to be corrected in front of 200 witnesses and choose to do better afterward rather than sulk about the correction. Betsy Larkin did not stay in service at Langley Chase. Within the month, Mina had written to her personally, offering her a position running the household staff at Ashbourne House itself, a position with real wages, real respect, and real authority over a full domestic staff twice the size of anything Langley Chase had employed. Betsy accepted before she had finished reading the second paragraph of the letter. She proved, in time, exactly as capable as Mina had suspected that first night in the ballroom when a 17-year-old maid had stepped between a stranger and a slap, for no reason except that kindness came naturally to her and cruelty did not. Wilhelmina Ashbourne kept her notebook for the rest of her life, filling volume after volume with a single line about every person she ever met, in ballrooms and boardrooms and village inns alike, still testing, always testing because her father had been right about one thing above all else. A person's true character shows itself most clearly in exactly the moment they believe no one of consequence is watching. Years afterward, when Mina finally allowed a young clerk to read through her earliest notebooks for the bank's historical records, the clerk found the entry written the very night of the Langley Ball in Mina's careful hand, dated and underlined twice. It was not an entry about Octavia Pemberton. It was not an entry about the Duke or the Emerald Silk Woman or Sir Reginald Cabot's icy snub at the supper table. It was the kindest line in the entire notebook, and it read simply, "Betsy Larkin. Took a blow meant for me and never once complained. The rarest kind of person. Build her a life worth having." She had built exactly that, and Betsy Larkin ran Ashbourne House for the next 30 years, fiercely loyal, fiercely capable, and never once forgetting the night a stranger in a wine-stained apron had quietly decided to change the whole shape of her future. So remember this: the next time you decide, even for a moment, that someone is beneath your notice, remember the ballroom, the 6 chandeliers, the laughter that died in stages, the apron that fit anyone at all. Ask yourself honestly which side of the tray you have stood on. Have you ever been the one holding the glass, laughing, without once wondering who was pouring the wine? Have you ever been the one carrying the tray, quietly watching, quietly remembering, while someone decided out loud that you did not matter? Power, real power, is often quietest, in exactly the room where everyone owes it money and does not yet know it. Here is the question worth sitting with tonight, and there is no easy answer to it. Wilhelmina Ashbourne let Betsy Larkin take a slap meant for her in order to protect a disguise that would ultimately deliver justice to an entire county. Doubling Betsy's wages afterward, giving her a home and a future, does that make the choice right? Or does some debt simply cannot be repaid, no matter how generous the payment offered afterward? You decide. Tell us which side you land on. This is Dukes and Duchesses, where every story is told the way it deserves to be told. Subscribe now, share this with someone today, and tell us in the comments which moment hit you the hardest. We will see you for the next story. It is already waiting.